Dr. Mark Jangizi here, the Science Moment. Last time I talked about whether or not folks can blame the radical Islamic jihad culture on the texts within Islam versus it being a cultural phenomenon. Of course, it's a cultural phenomenon either way, but the question is, the cultural phenomena due entirely to the text? And I think people over explain it by virtue of the violent texts that are in the religious text itself. And I talked about how, look, there's lots in the Old Testament, lots of violence stuff that has been used to justify violence in the past, but eventually a culture surrounding Christianity sort of pushed that down, and it's not, in fact, a particularly violent culture for at least the religious parts of it anymore. And then there's non-violent things like Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, which in fact has developed a culture around it, capital C communism, which ended up devastatingly violent, and the greatest genocides of the 20th century were due to capital C communism. So it's neither necessary nor sufficient. Having violent texts in principles undergirding a culture isn't necessary nor sufficient for a violent culture. You can have a violent culture either way, and you can have a non-violent culture independent of whether there's texts that underlie it that are violent. Now, what I wanted to bring up today was that we just saw this. We just saw in the last 3.5 years with COVID that you can end up with a quasi-religious, highly authoritarian, not per se violent, but willing to banish, fire, refuse medical treatment, and prevent from travel those who are unclean and the unvaccinated, right? These are very extreme quasi-religious views that quickly went worldwide, and nearly everybody held these views, right? And you were anti-vaxxer, you were radical to push back on these. Say, look, this is civil liberties violating. You were an outcast to even point that out, right? Where was the text? Where were the quasi-religious texts undergirding this new quasi-religion that suddenly formed? There weren't any. There was no lockdown texts that said you have to lock down. In fact, the texts, to the extent that they existed, said don't lock down. Even Event 201, bullet number 3 in 2019 said it's not a good idea to lock down. Right? Masking, all of the texts, all of the actual publications, and especially the RCTs, had no evidence that masks worked. Right? There was no civil liberties justification prior to that it was okay to violate civil liberties, informed consent, bodily autonomy, and force medication on individuals, much less billions of individuals. Nowhere was there text justifying these quasi-religious, authoritarian, coercive rules. Right? You don't need to have coercive principles to end up with a coercive, authoritarian, violent culture. Right? You don't need that. And you could have coercive, violent texts which lead to not a violent culture around it. All that depends is what's going on in the social narratives, and that's a completely different topic. These are the results of memes and how they spread through and how social narratives are formed, and much more complex emergent processes that happen. And the narratives and the texts in this case that back the culture aren't what's written in some old books. They're in the heads across the communities, constantly evolving, constantly developing. That's what one needs to focus on to change the culture of radical Islam. It can happen, and it doesn't require modifying or ignoring the fact that those old texts exist. Most Muslims have figured out how to live not as radical jihadis. Already implicitly, there are social narratives that allow it. And that was your Science Moment.